Hello and welcome back to our new session together. Our new lecture today will be another step in discussing certain concepts and axes of political science. As we agreed before, each lecture will have another identity. Maybe we're going to have tracks, informations, puzzles, etc., etc. And because we're going to have an advanced level from today on, we're going to make the amount of information each lecture less to give you enough time to discuss the particular data in each lecture. So welcome to our lecture together. Today we're going to have our 14th lecture. Again, we're going to complete the axes. If you do remember, we started to talk about the establishment, the definitions of state, and how does the definition of a state started. But before that, I want to know, do you know exactly the history of the political participation of women and the political life, especially in our Middle East? So I was thinking that because nowadays we are having a lot of ideas and cases of domestic violence and accuses for women to have certain particular issues. So I decided to spotlight on certain political science track and our case for today that the first woman that had started to have the right to be elected in the Arab parliaments. So, actually, when we start to talk about women political participation, definitely we're going to talk about the Egyptian political women because whenever we talk about political participation, definitely Egyptian women had a great participation, had a great impact in that track. And uh, we should say that the first time that women took the right to be elected for the elections and parliament elections was 1956. The first Egyptian woman who entered the parliament, then she became the first Arab woman who became parliament member in 1957, called Rawi Atiyah. She was one of the Egyptian parliament members. She was not only member, but also she turned to be part of الحزب الوطني الديمقراطي. Then she get re-elected in 1984 to be a parliament member for the second time. And the most important and remarkable point in this case is that she wasn't a normal female. She was also part of the Egyptian army, and that was a very important point to say that women from ages and decades used to be part of the political structure, whether the formal, the informal, the militarian, the institutional, etc. Why I decided to talk about this case? Because it is very sorry that we do see women in our community still struggle from domestic violence, while other women started to build their political track since decades. So I am waiting your participation in this. Please let me know if you did like this, if you dislike this, if you agree to have women in our parliament or not, if you even agree to have a woman as prime minister or not. I am so enthusiastic to hear from you. Okay, let's go back to our lecture together, city-state and nation of state. Then we're going to talk about constitution later on. As we agreed, discussed uh, the idea of this track as a whole to see the objectives behind these concepts or axes, to discuss the state as a core element in building political science, to see the relation between state and the society as a whole, then to discuss the idea of the civil society as a modern term, and we're going to raise certain questions during the discussion. We're going to talk also about the Constitution, about a modern element in building our community states, etc. Moving to the core objective, again, we're not focusing on the terms as a term as much as we concern about the progress track that these terms reflect, the idea of the dynamic accumulative knowledge that the terms reflect, the perspective historically, politically, economic, and culturally these terms or concepts embody. Uh, so again, it is not about the words itself, it's about the elements that shape these definitions and shape uh, the track of these definitions and perspectives as a whole. So, let's have a quick revision about what we did in the last lecture. In our previous lecture, we started to discuss the previous elements, and we said like we have four core elements shaping the community, which are population, territory, government, and sovereignty. Then we said we might have a fifth element, which is international relation. And nowadays we're going to add a new element that is very controversial and very argumentative, which is constitution. Nowadays, a lot of scholars say that it is impossible to have a community or a state without a constitution because they consider it part of the formal structure of the community. So while we talked about population and territory in the previous lecture, today we are going to discuss the remaining elements and components of these elements of the states. So, if we decide to talk about the government as the third element of shaping states, we can say that government is the agency which stirs the shape of the state. Without a government, state will be disdirected in a way or directionless. Here, the form of government doesn't matter. It could be presidential system, one party rule, or even a dictator state. There has to be a government, whatever the shape of this government is. In other words, government is nothing but the implementing arm of a state. Government in that system through which state expresses its will. The government makes law, punishments, lawbreakers, promotes welfare of people. But the idea of this is very dangerous. Let's go back again to the concept of the social contract. Do you remember when we said Hobbes and Locke started to see government as a very essential core element that we cannot get rid of? This gave a huge excuse for the government to abuse citizens, to have absolute privilege, and to have absolute authority over everything, and to turn to a dictator one in a way or another. So we cannot deny that it is an important point to have a government, but again, it is a very important point to decide what kind of governments do we need to protect the state. So if this government is incapable to protect the state or as a way as more affiliated to other or international powers, so it will destroy the state. Or for example, if the government is an abstract dictator one, definitely it will take the state to the end. So, whenever they started to discuss the element of having a government, they were concentrating on the idea of it is a must to have a government without discussing whether this government should have certain criteria to be built on, whether there should be certain structure to build this unit, which called government. But that was only in the beginning. Later on, as we will see in the coming lectures, a lot of scholars, thinkers, and even politicians argued this idea and refused totally to accept the idea of government in this abstract level. So moving to another or to the fourth element in building the state, which is sovereignty. A lot of scholars believe that sovereignty is the soul of the state. Before the 15th August 1947, India had territory, population, and government, but it didn't have sovereignty. The case that India suffered from reflects exactly the importance of sovereignty. And this could be described in two aspects actually: international, internal, and external. How? In an internal sovereignty, the state has ultimate, unlimited power within its territory. It enjoys final control over all people, associations, resources, etc., etc. Under external sovereignty, it means a state is free from external control, like we said before, occupations, etc. It can enter into international treaties or agreements and decide what kind of wars they want to be in and what kind of wars they don't want to be in. Some scholars believe that after UNO was formed in 1945, and more specifically after the age of globalization began in 1991, the scope of external sovereignty has shrunk considerably. But in all cases, it is very important to discuss the concept of sovereignty as a core element in shaping community and states. So if I do have people, I do have a government, I do have a geographic area, but I don't control all these, so what kind of state this could be? Uh, Again, whenever we discuss the relation between state and government, quite often, even well read, intelligent people tend to use state and government as if they are synonymous words in a way. In today's political science, they carry vastly different meaning. Hence, it is necessary to understand their meanings. Government may now define or be more clear that as one of four ingredients of the state. However, it has been specifically defined by various scholars, like, for example, Prof. Gettler defined it as it consists of all those people who are engaged in the implementing the will of the state, for example. In other words, it is the implementation and the implementing process of the state, which covers civil services, armed forces, and police forces. So, in a way or another, before even reaching the stage when we talk about the separation between authorities and divine government as the executive authority, they were concentrating on the function of the government as uh, the one who is running the state as uh, for example, for implementing the will of the state, the government is given all powers, resources, privileges, materials, etc. It must get obedience of all the citizens. It must also have the necessary power to enter into international treaties, international agreements, etc., etc. Garner, who is one of our important scholars, said government must be organized and it must possess the powers and necessary resources that it can enforce its authority, command, respect, and obedience. It should be able to maintain peace, order, and perform international obligation under the international law. And this is very critical point. Uh, the sovereignty of government is, in a way or another, restricted by the international law. Sorry. Garner here again described a new pattern of classification. It is not only having power and authority over people inside the state, it also maintain peace and order externally. It also have the power to build these obligations and coalitions in an internal and external. Okay, what do you think to have a nice comparison between state and government? Because, as we said before, some scholars, thinkers, and politicians even have this ambiguity between differentiating the identity of government and states. They still mix between the two terms and they still think they are, in a way or another, synonyms. So to avoid this ambiguity and misunderstanding, let's have certain elements to differentiate between the two terms in a way or another. And let's talk about 4 elements in differentiating between state and government. Okay, and the first element, state has 4 core elements, while government is one of these elements. So in a way or another, government is part of the state. Element number 2, state enjoys original and unlimited powers, while government has certain powers, but these powers are limited and delegated from people. Do you remember when we talked about the social contract and we said like the government is delegated and certain and has certain delegation from people, and they give up certain privileges and rights to the government in order or as a result to protect them. So this is exactly the idea of delegation we are talking about. A third element is that state is an abstract idea while government is a solid reality. A state, it's like it's an inspirational theme, it's a spiritual thing inside citizens, while government, it's a reality, it's institutions, employees, etc., etc. According to the territory, a state must have a territory, so territory is an essential element of a state. While on the other side, we can have governments without territory actually. So a territory is not a must for a government. Number 5, state is permanent because it's an abstract idea. Ideas are infinitive, while government is temporary. It's like a contract between people and certain citizens, other citizens, and it will end immediately when this contracting is over. A sixth element is that state is a universal phenomena with fixed elements, while governments are certain structure which could be dictator, which should or might be, for example, parliament, presidential, one-party rule, etc., etc. The core element that the state is a static phenomena, it's a stable phenomena, while governments are dynamic, changeable. The fifth element here is that state covers all citizens. All citizens are included in the state, whether they are inside the government, outside the government. Once they are inside this geographic territory, they are part of the state. While government is made up of only those who work for the government, of certain employees under certain contracting for certain period of time, or how it should be, for example, because actually a sarcastic point that once you start to be part of the government, you will never stop, and this is one of the funniest part of that. Okay, The last element here is that a person cannot have rights against the state, but a person can have rights against the government, definitely, because, as we said, the state is a spiritual state, while government is an institution that uh, you can have argument with, you can have certain situation or problem with, or actually you could even sue the government in a way or another when it's in the ideal way, if you could have an ideal way ever. Okay, after finishing discussing the core elements of the state, actually there is an idea inside my mind that, are these only the core elements we need to discuss? The answer was no. Some modern scholars decided that it is not only about these four elements, but we could also include a fifth element beside the international relations, of course, which we are going to determine separate lecture for, which called constitution. Constitution nowadays is a very critical, essential element in building states. Constitution are a separate tool to determine the identity of the state, their political life, social life, etc., etc. Some scholars nowadays says that uh, we cannot have a state without having constitution. That's why we decided to discuss constitution when we talk about the core elements of a state. The vast majority of contemporary constitutions describe the basic principles of the state, the structures and processes of government, and the fundamental rights of citizens, and a higher law that cannot be changed by an ordinary legislative act. This higher law is usually referred to as a constitution. The content and nature of a particular constitution, as well as how it relates to the rest of the legal and political order, varies considerably between countries, and there is no universal and uncontested definition of a constitution. Nevertheless, any broadly accepted working definition of a constitution would likely describe it as a set of fundamental legal political rules that have certain function. So, in other words, we cannot say that we can have certain definition for the constitution, but we can say we have certain functions or elements that determine the constitution. These elements, which determine the idea or the type of constitution, or the pattern or the perspective of a common definition of our constitutions, are as following. Number one, constitutions are binding on everyone in the state, including ordinary lawmaking institutions. Number two, concern the structure and operation of the institutions of government, political principles, and the right of citizens. Three, constitutions are based on widespread public legitimacy. Four, constitutions are harder to change than ordinary laws. For example, uh, um, two-thirds majority vote or a referendum is needed, for example, etc., etc. So it's not a normal law, it is something in a higher level of legitimacy. As a minimum, or number five, as a minimum, meet the internationally recognized criteria for a democratic system in terms of representation and human rights. Uh, when we do complete talking about constitutions as a core element in shaping and building states, let's say that constitutions must have certain functions to be valid or to be considered as core element in building states. Number one in these functions, constitutions can declare and define the boundaries of the political community. These boundaries can be, in a way or another, territorial. For example, the geographical borders of the state, the boundaries between states, etc., as well as its claims to any other territory or extraterritorial rights, and personal, the definition of citizenship, for example. Thus, a constitution often distinguishes between those inside and outside the polity. Number two, constitutions can declare and define the nature and authority of the political community. They often declare the state's fundamental principles and assumptions as well as where its sovereignty lies. For example, the French Constitution declares that France is an indivisible, secular, democratic, and social republic, and that national sovereignty belongs to the people, who exercise it through their representatives and by means of referendums. The Constitution of Ghana, for example, which built in 1992, states that the sovereignty of Ghana resides in the people of Ghana, in whose name and for whose welfare the powers of government are to be exercised. So, function number one, to determine the boundaries of the state and determine the idea of citizenship of the people. Number two is to determine the authority of the political community and the identity of the political community and regime as well. And the third function, constitutions can express the identity and the values of a national community. A nature or a nation building instruments, constitutions may define the national flag, anthem, and other symbols, and may make even certain norms about the values, history, identity of the nation. Number four, constitutions can declare and define the rights, duties of citizens. As we start to talk about the idea of citizenship, here we are talking in a deep way that we are talking about sets of rights and duties. Most constitutions include a declaration of fundamental rights applicable to citizens. At a minimum, these will include basic civil liberties that are necessary for an open and democratic society. Freedom of thought, speech, association, assembly, the right to live, the idea of set of rights, etc., etc. Due process of law and freedom from dictator and arbitrary arrest or unlawful punishment. Many constitutions go beyond this minimum to include social, economic, and cultural rights, or the specific collective rights of minority communities, for example. And that is one of the most important aspects of constitutions, to reflect the structure of the community as cultural components. Do you remember when we start talking about the states and we said that they only mentioned people without determining the religion, the races, etc., etc.? So here they were talking more that constitutions must declare the rights of minorities as part of its identity as a constitution. So actually, and to be a little bit objective and realistic, some rights may be applicable while other rights are not. Some rights may apply to both citizens and not citizens, such as the right to be free from physical abuse or taxation, or to be elected, or to be part of the government, etc., and so on. And here we can find the idea of the second level of citizenship, which is very dangerous in many communities. The fifth function of constitution is that constitutions can establish and regulate the political institutions of the community. Constitutions define the various institutions of government, describe their composition, powers, functions, etc., regulations, relations between them, etc., etc. At this particular age or era or time, we start to see an idea about separation between powers. So here, almost all constitutions establish a kind of separation between legislative, executive, judicial branches of government. In addition, they may be a symbolic head of state institutions to ensure that integrity of the political process, for example, the election process, the electoral commission, etc., and other institutions to ensure the accountability and transparency of these in power. The institutional typical structure provide mechanism for the democratic allocation and peaceful transfer of power. Sorry, an opposite for the others or to remove of those who abuse power or who have lost the confidence of people, for example. So it is not only shaping the community, it also shapes the parts of the community, the three powers, legislative, executive, and judicial. And again, to raise the idea of delegation of privileged rights between government and people. Constitutions in its sixth function must divide or share power between different layers of government or sub-state communities. What does this mean? In other words, many constitutions establish federal, quasi-federal, or decentralized processes for the sharing of power between provinces, regions, or other sub-state communities. These may be geographically defined as in most federations such as Canada or India, or they may be defined by cultural or linguistic communities actually, as other established communities, for example. Constitutions also can declare the official religious identity of the state and the track of building certain identity, demarcate relations between sacred and secular authorities. This is one of the most critical, particular, important elements in building societies and communities. The role of religion was and still and will ever be a critical question. Where does religion need to be in building communities and states? Where religious law is the core source of legislative authority, for example, or to which distance religion is a tool of government, etc., etc. Number 8, constitutions can commit states to particular social, economic, and development goals. And this is one of actually very ambiguous elements because who would put these goals actually? And this is the idea of ambiguity, like we want to force the government to do things, but who will put these things, for example? This may take the form of the judicially force of power to another level. The core question here is the question of commitment or the intent, or to which distance these commitments are valid. So, constitutions at this legal, social, political life had certain relation or certain formula in a way that we could reflect it in the following pattern. Like we have three core cycles determine the identity of the Constitution: the legal, the social, cultural, and power. All these elements are part of the structure of the Constitution in a way or another, actually. So if you're going to have the concept of Constitution as a core element of the state, we should understand that the relation between the elements are very critical. So we cannot say which is more important. Is it the government? Is it the constitution? Is it the people? Is it the geographic area? But the most important point to point in this lecture or in the end of this lecture is that all these elements are core fundamental elements that will form the base for our discussions and the coming lectures together. Finally, this session ends with your new puzzle. From your point of view, please name three important constitutions that you believe they are very important and tell me why. Thank you so much for joining me in this lecture. Hoping you are safe. Take care, and please always remember, things are not, they are exactly how you want to see it. Thank you so much.